This is Dr. Alicia. She's a resident physician.
I'm currently a PGY3, a senior pediatric resident, going into my final year of residency at the University of Toronto.
She was also trained in her home country,
I completed my medical school and internship years in Jamaica.
having had to beat all the hurdles and move here in a very difficult time.
Well, so I moved just before the pandemic hit.
She was able to put herself together and study for her exams.
What does CaRMS even mean? How do I apply? How do I find my way? Like, it felt like I was a needle in a haystack kind of thing.
All right, is residency really important?
It is a thing, like both things can be true.
Okay, all right, and personal statements.
Show, don't tell. And it seemed so...
Hi, dog. Good afternoon.
Hi, how are you? Nice to see you, Crespo.
Great. I am so happy you've been able to take out some time out of your running after time schedule. Come and have a chat.
There's no secret source, but I'm very happy to be here and thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from?
I'm currently a PGY3, a senior pediatric resident, going into my final year of residency at the University of Toronto. I am an IMG through and through and an international medical graduate. I grew up in Jamaica, which is where I did my med school training, and then I moved to Canada just before 2020 at the end of 2019 and applied for the match, and I've been moving ever since.
Wow, fantastic. And how was it? Like hard move? Was it easy to move?
Well, so I moved just before the pandemic hit. I would say the move in and of itself was an easy move, but the things that happened after it made it a bit hard because of restrictions, a lockdown, really feeling like I was on the outside, not having the insider information. That made it very difficult, but I will say out of that, I was still able to meet a few friends, few mentors, community members who have all been part of my journey and my process. So I think even though it wasn't the best of times, it certainly made part of my story. And I tell people all the time, if you can get through COVID and you can get through what happened in those years, then you can get through everything.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thanks. What made you to want to become a doctor?
So if I'm being honest, I will say that I always knew, like from a young age, and it probably sounds very cliche, but from a tender age, I just knew that I wanted to do something of service. And it was something that was instilled in me during childhood, even going through my formative years, primary or preparatory school, secondary school, was always part of service organization. And I think as a child too, even though I was fortunate to not have to visit the doctor's office many times, but every time I would go to the pediatrician's office, it was a time I would remember. Honestly, it was fun times. They'd have toys or games. And I remember my pediatrician was so warm, so personable. And so I wanted to emulate her. So that was the first step, I would say. But then as I went throughout my high school years, I really was gravitated towards the sciences, biology especially. And I thought medicine was a great way to culminate all of that with my interest in the science as well as my desire to give back. And so it was really just a natural progression from there. And once I left high school, I applied for medical school, got in, and the rest is history.
So was your journey from moving then from Jamaica to Canada, was it hard? Was it easy? Like how was it? Was it tough?
I think the journey moving from Jamaica to Canada wasn't necessarily difficult, but I don't think I fully understood or grasped what was going to happen. So my family had made this decision and we were thinking about moving from years before. And so I finally did it. I completed my medical school and internship years in Jamaica. I worked a few years as house officer, medical officer, and then moved to Canada, as I said, just before the pandemic hit. And at the time, I had no plan. I say it, and I don't know if people really believe me, but I didn't have a plan. I just knew that this was the next step and I would figure it out from there on. And so it was really being on the ground and trying to figure out, okay, what's the next step in terms of exams? How do I create an application? What does CaRMS even mean? How do I apply? How do I find my way? Like it felt like I was a needle in a haystack kind of thing. And so that part made it difficult for me, not necessarily the transition or the moving from Jamaica to Canada, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Of course, I do understand. So let's get right into it. Tell us a little bit about your QE1 journey.
Well, so I did have an idea before I left Jamaica that there were exams. I had a few med school colleagues and friends who, and when I say few, like literally one or two, who had moved before and they were actively going through the process where it was new to them. So those were the persons who I would lean on and ask for questions. And they also didn't necessarily have the entirety of the information.
Absolutely.
But I went on the Medical Council of Canada. I read up what they had, had my physician apply account, did all of that stuff. But again, that was it. I didn't know really and truly what I would need to do, what resources to look at, how the exam would be formatted. Like, would it be similar to what I was used to, or no, this is a North American exam? Would I have to change my way of studying? But I will say, during self-study, self-research, and reading blogs, reading up about people's experiences, I was able to find a few resources that were particularly helpful for me. So one of those being the USMLE UWorld Step 2 CK question bank.
Yeah.
That I would say was a big part of my study tool for the exam, in addition to the Medical Council of Canada practice tests, which are expensive and not everyone may be able to access that. But I will say it was, in my opinion, the best thing that gave me a real reflection of what the exam would be. And so I used that in addition to my medical school note and the Toronto notes that I think is well known and very popular and has really short form bullet points about different topics. And honestly, I would say that formed the majority of what my study regimen for QE1 exam was.
Yeah, wow. That's a lot of stuff you did. So how long did all of that take you? Like full time, or was it like part time?
No, it's an excellent question, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that what I was able to do, many persons don't have that opportunity. And so for me, I had come prepared that I was going to take a year off to just do the exams, prepare for whatever I needed to do, even though I wasn't sure exactly what that was. And so that was my plan. Of course, COVID hit, and of course, finances and resources run out. So it didn't necessarily go as I had planned, but I was able to take, I believe, 8 months in total. And just add in to say that when I originally registered for my QE1 exam, it was March or April, sometime in the springtime of 2020. But as we know, COVID came in March, everything got shut down. And so the exam was postponed indefinitely. There was no date or time. And so you add into that the feeling of anxiety and do I even prepare for this exam? I don't know when it's going to happen. It probably will delay my timeline and I won't be able to apply for the next cycle. So all of that. But, I pushed through and I studied for, I think that was the most diligent I've ever been in terms of self-study. And I studied for at least 6 months, but the whole time was 8 months. But I'll say at least 6 months really serious studying every day, like just work hours of the day, 8 to 5, 9 to 5, just going at it. And then practicing with practice tests under strict timelines, like trying to simulate the real exam, like start in the morning. It's a full day, no breaks. Well, there is a small break, but just going straight like you would do on the exam day.
Wow, that was a real grind. And you were doing that using the practice test from MCCQ, or how were you timing yourself?
So that's right. So I used the practice tests from from MCC for my practice run. And I think I also, this one didn't work out so well, but I was trying to do the USMLE UWorld Step 2 CK question bank under timing, because you do have that feature. But that one was a bit harder because the stems are quite long, and so it doesn't really necessarily reflect the QE1 exam, which is a bit different, and thankfully the stems are shorter, at least when I did.
And so you just essentially used these Q banks that you've said. Apart from that, were there other Q banks that you use? Because nowadays there's a ton of other Q banks. Which of the Q banks actually gives real value? People might not have enough resources, so we want to give them the best time. If we know what works, then just tell them.
No, that's an excellent point. It really depends on the learner or the person who is doing the exam and their techniques. For me, I had tried a few. You're right. Another popular one is the Canada Q Bank, but I tried that for about a few weeks or maybe even a month. It's good learning because you get to, gather information and you're learning things, but I think it was too time consuming and tedious for myself. And so I ended up in that one, and I really only use the QBank and the MCC practice test.
Oh, great. So when you took the exams, given that you were just taking exam post-COVID, did you do it in person or was it remote proctoring? And
mine was in the thick of COVID, yeah. So I did it in summer of 2020, and so it was remotely proctored.
Okay.
I don't have anything to compare it to. It's not like I had done any other international exams of the sort that were in person. So this was my first real experience. But I will say I enjoyed it. I was able to do it from the comfort of my apartment, in my own room, in a comfortable space, wearing my pajamas, and still get the exam done. So I loved it. Fortunately, had no technical issues or internet connectivity problems. So it was a breeze for me.
So in terms of that exams, how did you study? Were you studying with mates, alone? If you're studying with mates, where did you find them, and how can somebody get a good study partner?
I'm just thinking, because I think at the end of this, I'll reiterate so many times, it's really what works for you. And the caveat to that is it depends on the timing and the situation. Because for me, I've always been someone who studies by myself, and that it's not that I'm opposed to study groups. Like, I'm leaning into it a little bit more now, but I always thought, for whatever reason, like commute or timing, scheduling, it always worked out better for me to just do the studying whenever I could. And as I said too, I wasn't working at that time, so I was able to have all the time in the world. Basically, that was my only job, to study.
Jeez, and how did you keep the time? Because 6 months studying alone can be daunting.
I know, you definitely have to pace yourself. And I think for me, what I did is I looked at it as, because this was now about 3 years post-graduation from medical school, I looked at it as a time when I really got to study without something hanging over my head. Because as I said, I didn't know when the exam was going to be. It was just learning, something to do in the daytime, and it was just learning. To your point though, I know that there are study groups out there. I've seen online Facebook groups. I've seen programs that you can sign up for that help with that sort of thing. But again, I can't speak to it because it was COVID and we were so isolated. I didn't even know anyone to begin to ask if we could study together. I tried with a few med school colleagues and stuff, but again, because of the situation and everyone was going through a hard time, it didn't work out. So I just studied by myself.
Wow, that's a killer statement, because I just imagine when I took the exams, I did study with a bunch of people, because at the time I was still in Tokyo, and just having to figure out how to even do stuff, especially that there was very little information online. I was just lost in the whole process. But again, everyone should know themselves, right? And know what works for them, and try to figure that out early enough so that they can then get moved. On average, what would you say a reasonable study timeline is?
Remember, I said I would go back to this blanket statement. It really depends on the person. But that being said, I hear you and I agree with you 100% that it's a long haul for a lot of these questions, especially if you had already specialized or were working in a certain field. You're not really thinking about those questions, especially post-med school. And if you don't have a long enough time, then you run the risk of not studying broadly enough and not giving yourself the best chance at scoring a good or having a good score. And so honestly, I would say anywhere between 4 months and 6 months, in my estimation, would be a good study timeline. But adding on to that, it depends how many hours you're putting in a day, because if you're working or if you're studying part-time and you're only able to put in 4 hours in the evening, or maybe even 6 hours at night time, you may need to extend that a bit more or be on the longer side where it's 6 months. But I think if you're able to dedicate 4 months wholly and solely to studying for the exam and practicing the question, I think that would give yourself a good shot of doing well on the exam. And again, things happen, right? You might feel better some days than you do on other days. So giving yourself a grace as well, to know that every day is not going to be a killer day. I certainly had those days. I don't want, to portray a false narrative that I was just in my book every day. I had some days that were better than others. So giving yourself a grace to, and knowing that it's a long haul. And I say that in every sense of the word. CaRMS is just the tip of the iceberg, which is why I wanted to reiterate that point, like you were mentioning. When I started looking up things, there was a lack of information online, even word of mouth or asking friends or colleagues. It really felt like I was on the outside looking in, and I didn't have all the tools that I wish I would have. But I'll say that having gone through it now and being where I am, I take every opportunity to tell persons that it is possible. If you need the information, it's out there, it can be found. And I think just
Absolutely.
over the past 4 years, like there's been such a movement and such an improvement as well in what's available and what there, whether that's online, whether that's through videos like posts, podcasts, blogs, that's there for IMGs to utilize. So I'm really happy and excited to see what happens next.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why we're doing this. I remember for myself, I started studying like effectively because again, it's not just studying, but it's studying effectively and really looking for what work. I started studying. I didn't have to quit my day job. I was doing this with a full-time job because again,
Wow.
we're in Canada, right? And it's
Yeah.
inflation, all of this stuff. It was pretty expensive, but I started studying October and I took the test in February and I passed 100%, like skin in the game. You have to be at that stage. If not, it's
Yeah.
just going to be really hard because it needs time and dedication. So I totally agree with what you're saying. We also need NAC. Let's talk about NAC. Tell me a little bit
Sure.
about your experience with NAC.
My experience with NAC was actually a funny one to me because it was COVID and
Yeah.
we weren't allowed to touch patients. So imagine doing an OSCE or a clinical exam that
Yeah.
involves physical examination, but you're not able to touch the patient. So it
Oh my.
was the weirdest thing. It was quite bizarre, but we had to pivot and adjust for the time. Honestly, I would say that it turned out better than I anticipated. So instead of doing an abdominal exam, I would say I would then go on to palpate the abdomen, light touch, deep touch, that sort of thing. Say what you're
Everything
checking.
is just verbal. You were just verbalizing.
Everything. It was more an exam to see like how you could report or articulate or say what you were going to do than it really was physical exam and checking your exam skills and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it was what I expected. Outside of that, it was what I expected for an OSCE. So I had
yeah.
been used to OSCEs going through med school. You have different stations, some with
Mhm.
patients, some without, some you're doing a history. I felt like it was manageable from that point of view. There is nothing that I can recall that really threw me off. But of course, that's relevant to what your experience with OSCEs are and how well you're prepared for that sort of exam.
Absolutely. Tell me about your preparations. How did you prepare for the whole thing? Like, was it within the same 6 to 8 months that you were using for your QE1?
That's a good question, and the answer is no. So I I started out by saying, how well and how dedicated I was for QE1, and that was the complete opposite. That was
So
because
did you get your result for Q1 before you started preparing for the NAC?
I don't think I did, no, because I had them like a few weeks apart, maybe two
Oh,
or
okay.
3 weeks apart. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
So even for the NAC OSCE, it was supposed to be in September in the fall. It was at that time postponed, or we weren't sure if it was going to happen, and then they finally came out said actually it's going to happen. You just won't touch patients. And so for me, a lot was going on family wise at that time. I was moving, like new additions to the family, that sort of thing. And just because of those demands, I wasn't able to put in the hours. And that again underscores what we were talking about before. And I really want persons to know, use your situation and find the bits of pockets of time and use it effectively. I love that you use that word. So it works for you because, Crespo, you said you had 6 months, but you were
Yeah.
working full time. There are
Yeah.
persons who are working part time who probably can't even dedicate the time. And I remember trying to study before moving to Canada multiple times, and it didn't go anywhere. So I really want to underscore that point that you really have to do what works for you.
Yeah.
And my preparation for the NAC OSCE was mostly reviewing physical examination, even though I wasn't going to touch the patient, but knowing the different components and parts of it, what you would look for, what were positive findings, negative findings, what they would mean. And also trying to tailor it because I was used to a more British examination system and tailor it to a North American system. And sometimes there minor tweaks or changes in how they do their examinations. So
Yeah.
the way I went about that was reading the
Yeah.
Edmondson manual, of clinical skills. And so I read through that a bit. tried to practice on family members and friends again, even though I knew I wasn't going to do it, but to bring back to my remembrance some of those things that I had lost since med school. And honestly, just the knowledge base that I had come to garner over the previous 6 to 8 months to try to help me to push through, and that was all I did for my preparation.
Wow, fantastic. Lucky you. Did you have a group of friends this time around that you were practicing on?
So, and this is the part that I want to say for sure, an OSCE or a clinical exam, you need people. That one, I don't think it's advised to do on your own, because you need someone to see what you're doing, to comment on it, and someone who knows. But again, unfortunately, it was just the case that I didn't have that because it was COVID. And
Yours,
so
you must be very special. It's tough.
again, I think things turned out for the best in the end, that I wasn't able to touch the patients, because maybe it wouldn't have gone so well. I don't know.
Yeah.
But because I didn't have to worry about that element of things, it was less stressful for me. So I really just utilized my family, because that's all I was really seeing during that time, to be
Mhm.
my standardized patients, or to be, well, I will add, I had a few friends who are from med school as well, who did help me just simulate, like, if this was a history station, what would you ask? So that also helped. But for the physical examination, finding or practicing with someone in front of you, yeah, that was mostly family.
Okay, perfect. So, what would you advise someone who is around that stage? What would you tell them to do? Because there's a lot of
Yeah,
negative energy out there on the internet. People say it's hard, it's not
yeah.
possible, it's not totally worth it. Just go do something else, become a nurse or something like that.
It really has to speak to your personality, your perseverance or tenacity. Because if you want to find something negative, you will find it, and it's
Oh, nice.
definitely out there.
Yeah.
So I tell people all the time, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And I've heard, and I've had so many friends, colleagues, who have proven that just over the past like 3 or 4 years. And so it's something that I'm trying to push that out there, to change the narrative that, you can't become a doctor in Canada, because that's certainly what I was told before moving here. And I want to say that that is false. It's not true. There are barriers in place and things within the system that does make it harder for us, for sure, but it's
Mm.
not impossible. To answer your question, though, I will say that for the NAC OSCE preparation, I think it's important, if you're able to find a group of colleagues, friends, study partners who you can practice with, because of course the exam is back in person, and you do have to touch the patient. So someone who can comment on your examination skills, you can get to practice that flow of, as you said, examining, reporting,
Mhm.
synthesizing the information, answering the questions correctly. So I think that is helpful. There are places online that you could find, as I mentioned, like Facebook groups or different programs. If that's something that you're able to do, you could explore that. But I also want to say, if you're not able to do those things, don't see it as a negative. I don't see it as a must for you to be able to excel or to move forward, because you can certainly do it if you don't have those. I will say for me that was the case, and I don't know, maybe they're more like myself, but it's all about thinking of how you can work with what's available to you, whether that's time, resources, skills, and using that to push forward.
Absolutely. So, when you got your results, both of them, and you passed, how did you feel?
Well, should I be honest or diplomatic? Well,
Just
I'm
be
I'm
honest.
I'm just joking. I'm just joking. Everything I'm saying here is strictly honest. I laugh because there was only one time. Like, I had already made up in my mind that for the cost that I was paying, I was only doing these exams one time. So when
Absolutely.
I passed, it was more like, okay, reassurance. But I won't say that I was overjoyed or elated, because that's what I was expecting of myself. But
Absolutely.
I will say too that I've had some colleagues or friends who maybe they did pass or maybe they didn't, and maybe if they did pass, it wasn't to the degree that they wanted to. And so I'm aware of that. But I will say, medicine is hard, and this journey switching from one program or one jurisdiction, one region to another is hard. So I'm always about giving yourself grace, especially if you are doing it in conjunction with something else. If you're working, if you're taking care of a family, if you're a caregiver, you're taking care of loved ones, and you're trying to, it's no easy feat. So I don't
Exactly.
think, I don't think persons should beat up on themselves for that. If it
Yeah.
doesn't happen on the first time, try again. And if it doesn't happen on the second time, try again. I read stories of persons who have applied to the match and done exams multiple times before finally getting in. So it's a testament to the fact that perseverance is important, and you can get the end result if you just push through.
Correct. Thank you so much. And that transitions us to that match, CARMS. It's
Yeah.
another big part of, like, is it really? It feels like like once you're done with the exams, it's just like, all right, now I'm going to the next one, which is even way more important. So
I'm so happy that you put it like that, because that's exactly how I felt. I felt like, okay, well, I've done the exams now, and this was gonna be more, it was gonna be smooth sailing or easier than before. But it was just opening up the door. And you can tell me which parts you want me to talk about specifically, but I could speak at length about CARMS, the different parts, and everything I had to learn at that point in time. And even since then, I'm still learning, and things I've learned from my co-residents, from colleagues who've done it for different programs. But it really is a world of its own.
after we've passed both exams, we're
Yeah.
looking at CARMS. What are the important steps that every IMG, or anyone for that matter, Canadian graduates should take into consideration?
Okay. So one is the curriculum vitae or CV, which is an
Yeah.
important part. You want to allow yourself to shine through that, your
Yeah.
past work, past experiences, scholarly work, especially that you've done. That could include research or medical education. It could include like focus groups or peer groups, as well as volunteer activities and the extracurricular part. I think that the last one that I mentioned in terms of that extracurricular piece sometimes gets lost or not placed as high up or as important. I don't want to say it trumps, your scores or your work experience, but I do think it's definitely important, and it comes up in your interviews once you make it to that stage, because it's a talking point and things for interviewers to ask you about. So if I were supposed to highlight the parts, it would be your work experience or clinical experience, research experience, and scholarly work. Of course, your exams are going to be a big part of the CARM CV, and the extracurricular stuff as well.
Okay. So should people tell of the success of their exams on their CVs, or to just leave it out because anyhow you qualify and you would definitely share it with CARMS anyway. So
I don't think it's necessary. It's already shared with CARMS through your Medical Council of Canada platform. And
yeah.
and I also omitted one thing that I should have included in that part. It may apply to some, it may not apply to others. But if you had done electives during medical school, then that is also a big thing to play upon. Electives and work experience, I kind of think of it to go hand in hand. But for some, they might have electives, whether undergraduate during med school or postgraduate if they did a residency or training or postgraduate training afterwards. But the reason I don't think about it was because I didn't have that on my CV, and so I had to become creative of using my work experience to display that I do have quality and skills that are in line with the field that I want to work in, and to demonstrate that on my application.
All right. Is recency really important? I hear recency in practice everywhere all the time. Is it really a thing?
It is a thing. Like, both things can be true. It is a thing, but as it's listed on the CARMS website, and I don't want to misquote, but it outlines, how long is too long, that sort of thing. If you graduated like 8 years ago or 10 years ago or something, to have work experience within the past 3 years, something of the sort. And that is because they're trying to get a sense of how far away are you from actually working, like direct patient facing care. How far away are you in terms of guidelines and what happens now? Is it that you're practicing a decade ago, like medicine from a decade ago? Is it evidence-based medicine, that sort of thing?
Sure not.
But I have seen it where persons have graduated from med school like within the past decade or so, and they've still been able to match. So I think historically, and when I say historically, I mean like 4 or 5 years ago, it sounded to me like if you had graduated outside of 3 years ago, it's a death sentence. But again, I think all of those things are based on person's experiences, the stories that they're told or they hear, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible.
Okay. All right. And personal statements, how important are those and how should we write it even?
So the personal statement is, again, in my mind, and that's why I categorize it, is a part on its own. It is definitely important because that is your place to shine and for people to get to know you. So I think of the CaRMS application in different silos, and that's just how my brain works. But earlier we were talking about the application, and so I was more talking about, the black and white stuff, or this is exactly what I did. It's either that or this. The personal statement is where you're able to take what's on that part of the application, the black and white, and make it into a story and make it show the committee who you are as a person. And laughing a little bit in my head because I remember when a friend of mine would say, show, don't tell. And it seemed so unreasonably hard to be able to do that with words. I'm like, I have to tell you, I'm writing a letter. It's words. But it took me some time. And when I say time, I mean months, writing and rewriting to understand what that really means. Sure, it's more than using descriptive words, but it's also presenting it in a way where it really is storytelling and taking something that might seem basic on paper, bringing it to life and showing how you were instrumental in whatever that was and what skills you had to use or how you were able to bring that to why you want to do whatever specialty it is that you're applying for.
Wow,
I hope that makes sense. But it
makes a lot of sense. One of my principles in life is usually just show, don't tell. I usually don't like to tell a lot because the more you tell, sometimes you're not a good explainer. You might not just be a good teacher. Just show someone how to do it. Like, this is what I actually want you to do.
And the other thing, just quickly, that I want to mention about the personal statement, and it's a big jump that I had to make, is approaching it from the mindset of you're talking to colleagues or you're talking to someone who already knows you, and you're literally just putting it on paper. Because when you think of it like, oh my gosh, I'm applying for this job, in a way, these people don't know me. I have so much on my shoulders. This is such high stake, which it is, but it adds an extra element of pressure, and sometimes you get in your head, you get writer's block. So if you approach it as, say you're going to write a biography or you're going to tell a reader something more, easygoing or lower stakes, it really helps you to just be a bit more free and let it all on the paper, and so people can know who you really are.
Absolutely. So it shows that every component of CaRMS is just by itself, and you need to think about each of them separately and then bring all the pieces of the puzzle together.
At least that's what worked for me. I don't know if that will work for everyone, but that's exactly how I think. I think each part serves a different purpose, and all together it creates the puzzle or the masterpiece, and they serve different purposes. Yeah.
Absolutely. But are they weighted differently? I mean, the different elements, say your CV, letters, your exams, and there's also one key thing that I wanted to ask, references. Like,
I can control what I do or what I display to my references, but I really can't control what they write on the paper. I guess one way in which I can control it is by who I ask, because I want to ask persons who I've had adequate exposure to them with time. They're able to see my skills, and if they're not able to see my skills, I still want someone who can speak about the professional personality traits. So timeliness, like being on time to work, dressing professionally, interaction with persons, being respectful, communication skills. Those all form part of who you're going to be as a physician and who you already are.
Absolutely.
So in terms of references, I would say if you're able to use a combination of medical school plus or minus postgraduate training or work experience and Canadian references, in my mind, that's the best setup. I've heard things before, and I can't really speak to the validity of that, but in my mind, it makes sense. And that is that you need Canadian references in order to match or to get into our program.
Ideally, physicians.
Oh, sorry, I should have specified. Yeah, so Canadian physician. It makes sense to me because if you're applying to a Canadian residency training program as a physician, they would want Canadian physicians to vouch for you and to say you're operating at the level of someone who is either going into this program or would excel in this program. Yeah. So that makes sense to me. But again, because I am well aware that every situation is unique, I wonder if there are cases where persons have matched and they don't have Canadian references, but perhaps they may have references of physicians who they've either trained with, so professors, or supervising physicians, heads of department, other colleagues, who may speak about, what they're able to do in a clinical setting. And once it's well written in detail, because that's also another thing, like some persons might be more brief and won't show. Remember, we spoke about show, don't tell. They won't show the type of candidate that this person is because they just haven't gone into enough detail. But I do think it's important not to discredit having references from whether that's medical school, postgraduate training, or work experience after med school, because those persons can often speak so highly and richly about what you're able to do that it will tip the margin or move the needle. And I feel, I don't know for sure, of course, but I feel like that was part of what may have helped my application, because I did get persons who were able to speak about me as a clinician, whereas I had Canadian physicians who were able to speak more about those soft skills or professional skills and research skills that I was working on while I was in Canada.
Wow, I think that's a good one, because a lot of people just say, oh, 100% you need to go Canadian, and then they're, in clinics trying to get observerships for 4 weeks. And come on, to be honest, you go for 4 weeks and you go, let's say, once or twice a week in the evening for like 3 hours. That person can't really say much about you. And they will be reluctant, except they're a very nice person. And I don't know what they will write in terms of how long they've known you, because sometimes they're like, they want someone that's known you for a long time. I know someone who actually matched in Montreal into public health, and they had no Canadian references. Like they match into McGill, but they had no one recommending them from Canada. But again, I don't know the other components of the application. It's a package, right?
And that's exactly it. It is a package, and that's why I'm not surprised that you've said that. No, I don't have any specific stories that are coming to mind right now, but I think I've heard of a similar situation where there were no Canadian physicians who provided references, and they were still able to match, and in a top program as well. But I will say, though, to your point, I think it's quality over quantity, because you could spend months with a person and they're not able to produce a strong reference letter, which is what you want. So the key word is strong. And I had done observerships for sometimes weeks, maybe up to a month, and gotten strong reference letters from those interactions. So I don't want to discredit the time either, but if you have the time, whatever time that is, make the most of it, make the best of it, and showcase yourself so that you're able to get a strong reference letter at the end.
Thank you so much. As we're rounding up, can you just tell me, maybe my last question for you would be, how are they weighted? Like, how are these things? Do they have different percentages on your final application, say your resume, your test result, your references? Like, do they have different percentages and an overall score that would decide on whether you match or not? Like, how does it work?
So I don't have the exact answer to that question, but I think I can provide some clarity on pieces of it to say that it really depends on the program. So I've heard of programs that screen by your QE1 score or your exam scores. And because, remember, there's so many international medical graduate applicants and only very few spots. So it just happens that there has to be a way to cut down the large numbers. And so some programs use that. I think some use a scoring system, but I don't know how much it's weighted one versus the other. But I will say it is very much a package, which was the point I was going to reserve for a little later on, to say that your score may be a little bit lower. Like for one program, your score might be a bit lower, but your personal statement, your CV is very strong, so that moves you up into a higher category than if you had just been screened by your exam scores. So I don't have the exact answer, but I will say it is very much a package, and they look at each section, and different programs are going to go about their resident selection differently. So it's hard to provide one blanket statement for all of the programs that exist.
Maybe now into residency, how do you like it? Is it cool? Is it?
So it's a mixture. And another statement I have is residency is hard, like full stop. And that's something I've had to remind myself over time too. But it's only for a time. And if you look at it with a growth mindset that, this is going to be a hard period of my training, of my life, but I'm going to try to garner as much as I can, build my skills, learn as much as I can, because I know at the end of it, when I'm the physician or the clinician, these are the experiences that I'm going to be drawing on, like going through my training.
All right, doctor, thank you so much for taking your time. I really appreciate it. And I hope this is going to help everyone. So thank you.